The most powerful music producer in the city had a wager he'd like to make when he'd been drinking. And on this particular night, in a private studio lounge full of platinum records and people who agreed with him for a living, he made it to a 66-year-old black man who played guitar for tips on a corner downtown. $1 million, the producer said, swirling something amber in a glass that cost more than the old man's whole instrument. If that beat-up piece of junk in your hands can outplay my band. He said it laughing, and the room laughed with him, because that was the room's job. The old man set down the guitar case he'd carried in out of the rain, looked at the producer for a long, quiet moment, and asked one question that wiped the smile clean off every face that had been laughing. He asked whether the producer wanted to put that in writing. To understand how Cornelius Reed came to be standing in that lounge with rain still on his collar, you have to go back to the corner. And the corner, you have to understand, had been his for 19 years. It was a good corner, by the standards musicians use, which are not the standards other people use. It sat at the mouth of a transit station, where the foot traffic was heavy from 7 in the morning until the trains thinned out at night. And it had an overhang that kept the worst of the weather off, and the acoustics off the brick and the glass had a warmth to them that Cornelius had learned, over 19 years, to play into the way you play into a room you know. He set up at the same time every morning. He laid the same blue cloth in his open case, not for the money so much as because a man should have a place to put what people gave him that wasn't the bare ground. He tuned by ear, always, never with a clip-on tuner, because his ear was better than any machine they made, and he saw no reason to insult it. The guitar was old. That part of the producer's insult, at least, was true. It was an acoustic with a worn spruce top gone amber dark with age and the oils of his hands. A crack near the bridge he'd repaired himself decades ago with hide glue and a clamp and a patience most luthiers had lost, and a pickguard worn clean through in the shape of his own strumming hand. It did not look like much. To a man who measured instruments by their finish and their price, it looked like junk. To anyone who knew how to listen, the first note told the truth, because an instrument that has been played every single day for 40 years by a master develops a voice the way a throat does, opens up, the wood vibrating freer each year, until it does not sound like a guitar, so much as it sounds like a particular human being who happens to speak through wood and string. Cornelius played that corner in a coat gone shiny at the elbows, with a thermos of coffee and a folding stool, and the people who passed every day knew him the way you know the fixed stars of your commute. The woman at the coffee cart, the man who sold papers, the old black man with the guitar whose music you stopped hearing as music after a while and started hearing as the sound of the morning being itself. Some of them tipped, most did not. He did not play for the ones who tipped. He had stopped, decades ago, being able to tell the difference between playing for money and playing because the not playing was unthinkable. What none of them knew, because Cornelius Reed did not narrate his life to people hurrying past, was that the worn hands on that old guitar had once been the most sought-after session hands in the city. There had been a time, 40 years back, when Cornelius Reed's playing was on records the whole country knew without knowing it was him, because session men did not get their names on the front of anything. He was the guitar under the famous voices. He was the part you hummed without knowing you were humming a man who would be playing for tips at a train station 4 decades later. He had played on hit after hit in the good studios with the great ones, and he had been, by the testimony of everyone who worked with him, one of the 2 or 3 best pure players in the city, the kind of musician other musicians went quiet to listen to. And then the industry that used his hands had thrown them away, the way it threw away a great many black men whose genius it rented and never bought. There had been a producer, back then, a young hungry one, who took songs Cornelius had built the guitar parts for the signature lines, the hooks that lived in the body before they lived in the words, and put his own name on the writing credits, and paid Cornelius a flat session fee of scale for work that would earn that producer royalties for the rest of his life. It was legal. That was the cruelty of it. Cornelius had signed the papers because in those days a session man who would not sign the papers did not get called again, and a man who did not get called did not eat. And so the genius signed away the ownership of his own genius across 100 sessions, and the city filled up with hits built on Cornelius Reed's hands with another man's name on the paper. That young, hungry producer had grown, over 40 years, into the most powerful music producer in the city. His name was Vincent Marsh, and he had built an empire on a foundation that included, though he had long since stopped thinking about it, the uncredited, unpaid, unowned genius of a man now playing for tips 3 miles from his studio. Cornelius had not forgotten. A man does not forget the hands being taken off the wheel of his own life. But he had also not spent 40 years bitter, because bitterness was a thing that ate the man holding it and left the man it was aimed at untouched. And Cornelius had decided, somewhere in the long middle of his life, that he would not give Vincent Marsh his piece on top of everything else Marsh had already taken. He played his corner. He raised, on the small money the corner made and the smaller money of a few teaching students, a granddaughter named Simone, whose mother, his daughter, had died young, and Simone was the thing his life was actually about. The reason the corner was not a tragedy but a job. The way any father's job is not a tragedy but the thing he does so the child can become. Simone was 17 now, and she could play. She could play the way her grandfather played, which is to say she had the thing that cannot be taught sitting on top of the 40 years of things he had taught her. And she was, that fall, applying to a conservatory 3 states away. The kind of school that turns a gift into a life. The kind of school whose tuition was a number Cornelius could not say out loud without the corner of his mouth doing something complicated. He had been putting money aside for 11 years in an account she did not know about, and it was not enough. And it was not going to be enough. And that was the quiet arithmetic he carried up to his corner every morning underneath the music. The night it all came apart, Cornelius had not gone looking for Vincent Marsh. The rain had sent him off his corner early, and he had ducked into the lobby of a building to wait it out. And the building, by an accident that was not entirely an accident, because the city is smaller than it pretends, housed on its upper floors the studio complex Marsh ran. And Marsh, that night, was throwing the kind of party he threw, a lounge full of artists he was courting and executives he was impressing and hangers-on whose whole function was to laugh. And one of those hangers-on, coming down for a smoke, had seen the old man with the guitar case sheltering in the lobby and thought, in the cruel, reflexive way of people who perform cruelty as wit, that it would be funny to bring him up. He told Cornelius there was a party upstairs, that the great Vincent Marsh was holding court, that an old street player might pick up some real money playing for real music people. He said it the way you'd coax a stray in for the amusement of watching it in a nice room. Cornelius understood exactly what was being offered, which was not kindness but spectacle, himself as the spectacle. He looked at the rain coming down outside. He thought about Simone and the number he could not say out loud, and he made a decision that he could not fully explain even to himself, except that some part of him, after 40 years, wanted to stand in a room with Vincent Marsh one time and be seen, even as a joke, even as a stray brought up for laughs. He picked up his case and he followed the man to the elevator. The lounge was everything Cornelius had once worked in and been shut out of. The platinum records on the walls. Some of them, he knew without looking closely, were records his hands were on. The soft, expensive light. The people who had the particular gloss of people who had never once worried about a number they couldn't say out loud. And at the center of it, holding court, grayer and heavier than the young man who had taken Cornelius's hooks, but unmistakably him, was Vincent Marsh. Marsh did not recognize him. That was the thing Cornelius noted first, standing dripping at the edge of the lounge. And it was somehow the deepest cut of the whole night, deeper than what came after. 40 years of using a man's genius, and the face that went with the hands meant nothing. Cornelius was just an old black street player someone had dragged up as a bit. "What's this?" Marsh said, catching sight of him, already grinning for his audience, already turning the old man into material. The room turned with him. The hanger-on explained, performing it, the street musician from the lobby. Wouldn't it be a laugh? And Marsh, who had been drinking, who was 3 glasses into the swirling amber and into the version of himself that liked an audience, looked Cornelius and his battered guitar up and down and decided to be generous, in the way powerful men are generous when generosity is really contempt. He said the old man could play something. He said it the way you toss a coin at someone's feet. And the room arranged its face for amusement. Cornelius did not play. Not yet. He set his case down, and he took out the old amber-topped guitar, and he checked the tuning by ear, slow, deliberate, the way he did everything, and the deliberateness of it. The refusal to hurry for the room was the first thing that put a small crack in the lounge's certainty, because junk in the hands of a joke does not get tuned with that kind of care. Marsh, sensing the room's attention shift a half-degree off of him and onto the old man, did the thing men like Marsh do, which was reassert himself by raising the stakes into cruelty. "Tell you what," he said, loud, swirling his glass, playing to the whole lounge now. $1 million. I'm serious. $1 million if that beat-up piece of junk in your hands can outplay my band. He gestured at the corner of the lounge where, in fact, his current session players sat. The young polished band he'd brought in to impress the artists he was courting. Real players, good ones, with new instruments worth more than cars. Go on. Outplay them. $1 million. The room laughed. It was the laugh the room was built to produce. The old man, the junk guitar, the impossible sum, the great Vincent Marsh being magnificent. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of moment the hangers-on would describe for weeks. Cornelius let the laughter finish. He had learned, on a corner where you compete with train announcements and traffic for a stranger's ear, exactly how long to wait for a room to give you its silence. He waited for it now, and into the settling quiet, in a voice that was not loud and did not need to be. The voice of a man who had spent 19 years making himself heard over the sound of a city. Cornelius Reed asked his question. "You want to put that in writing?" The smile on Vincent Marsh's face did a complicated thing. The laughter in the room thinned, because there had been something in the old man's voice that did not match the bit. A flatness, a certainty. The sound of a man who was not playing along but was instead, somehow, calling. Marsh, cornered by his own audience into not backing down, waved a hand and said, sure, put it in writing, why not? And one of the executives, a younger woman who handled Marsh's contracts and who was not as drunk as her boss, and had begun, watching the old man tune, to feel a thin, cold thread of warning, said carefully that they should not actually. "I'll write it up," Marsh said, grinning, performing confidence. $1 million if the street guy outplays the band. I want to see this. So she wrote it. On studio letterhead, because that was what was at hand. A few lines. The wager, the sum, the condition, signed by Vincent Marsh with a flourish meant to entertain, witnessed by half a dozen laughing executives who would all, within the hour, wished they had been somewhere else. It was a joke contract. Everyone in the room understood it as a joke. Cornelius Reed took it, read it slowly, all the way through, the way he had learned to read everything slowly 40 years too late, folded it, and put it in the inside pocket of his shiny elbowed coat. Then he sat on the edge of a chair and settled the old guitar against the worn place in its top that fit him like nothing else on earth, and he played. What happened in the room over the next 4 minutes was a thing that several people present would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. He did not play fast at first. He did not do the thing a man trying to win a contest would do. The flashy thing, the showing off thing. He played something slow and old, a blues that came up out of the guitar like it had been waiting in the wood, and the first thing that happened was that the worn old instrument, the junk, opened its throat in that expensive room and produced a sound that none of the new guitars in the corner could have made. A warmth, a humanity, 40 years of one man's hands having played the wood awake. The laughter did not just stop. It was retroactively embarrassing, the way the laughter of people who have misjudged something badly becomes embarrassing the instant they understand. And then Cornelius Reed, 66 years old, rain still drying on his collar, began to actually play, and the room understood, slowly and then all at once, that they were not watching a joke. They were watching one of the great players any of them would ever hear in their lives, in a small room, up close, for free. The young band in the corner, the good players, the ones with the car-priced instruments, were the first to understand it fully, because they were the ones who knew enough to know what they were hearing, and one by one they stopped lounging and sat forward, and the bass player, a kid of maybe 25, set down his drink and put his hand over his mouth, because he was a good enough musician to recognize that he was in the presence of a thing he had only heard about. The playing of the generation that built the foundation his whole career stood on. The uncredited hands. Marsh's smile was gone. He was sitting very still now, the amber glass forgotten in his hand, and something was working behind his face, because somewhere in the second minute of that playing a memory 40 years buried had begun to surface, the way a body surfaces from deep water, slowly and then breaking. He knew that playing, not the man, the playing. He had heard those hands before. He had built a career on those hands before. The specific phrasing, the way the notes leaned, the signature behind the signature, it was on records in his own catalog, records with his name on the writing, and the old man in the shiny coat was playing in the unmistakable voice of the session guitarist, whose hooks Vincent Marsh had been collecting royalties on for 40 years. The color went out of Vincent Marsh's face in the particular way it goes when a man recognizes, too late, the exact shape of his own past walking back through the door. Cornelius brought it down soft at the end, the way he ended every set on his corner, a quiet resolving phrase, and he let the last note ring in the wood until it faded on its own, and then he laid his right hand flat across the strings to still them. And the room was so silent that the rain on the windows was the loudest thing in it. For a moment, no one moved. Then the young bass player in the corner started to clap, alone, helplessly, the way you clap when you have just been given something, and the rest of the band joined him, and then the room, the executives and the artists, and even some of the hangers-on. Because a thing that real cuts through even the people who came for the joke. Cornelius did not acknowledge the applause. He was looking at Vincent Marsh. And Vincent Marsh was looking at him with the expression of a man watching a debt he had pretended for 40 years did not exist walk across the floor toward him. "You know me now," Cornelius said. It was not a question. The room quieted again, sensing that the actual thing, whatever it was only now beginning. Took you 4 minutes. Took you hearing the hands. The face never did mean anything to you. He shifted the old guitar on his knee. Cornelius Reed. The name landed on Vincent Marsh like a hand on the shoulder. Several of the older executives in the room, the ones who had been in the industry long enough, made small sounds because they knew the name too, knew it as a legend spoken of in the past tense, one of the great lost session players, a man some of them had assumed was dead. "I played 100 sessions for you," Cornelius said, and his voice was still quiet, still even, the voice off the corner that could ride over a city. "More. I built the guitar parts you put your name on, the hooks, the lines people still hum. I signed your papers because in those days, a man who wouldn't sign didn't get called, and I had a daughter to feed. You paid me scale. You've been collecting on my hands for 40 years. He paused. "I'm not telling this room anything you don't know, Vincent. I'm telling it so they know it too." The lounge was utterly still. The artists Marsh had been courting, the young ones, were looking at the most powerful producer in the city with something new and cold in their faces, because the story being told in front of them was the exact story they had each been privately afraid of. The story of the genius used and discarded and uncredited. And here it was, 66 years old in a shiny coat, told plain. The contract executive, the one who had tried to stop it, had gone pale, because she alone in the room had fully understood, from the moment the old man asked to put it in writing, what was coming. And she understood now that it had come. Cornelius reached into his coat and took out the folded paper, the joke contract, and he unfolded it slowly and held it up so the room could see it. "You wagered me $1 million in writing, witnessed by everyone here, that this junk guitar couldn't outplay your band," he said. "Your band's in the corner. Ask them." He did not look at the band. He did not have to. The young bass player, the one who had started the applause, said, into the silence with the helpless honesty of a kid who could not have lied about music if his job depended on it, and it might have. "He outplayed us. He outplayed anybody. That wasn't close." It was the truest verdict the room could have produced, because it came from the one person in it whose judgment on the only question that mattered could not be bought, the musician himself, and everyone knew it. Cornelius folded the contract back up and returned it to his coat. "Now," he said, "we both know you can fight this. You've got lawyers in this building right now who'd have that paper picked apart by morning. A drunk wager, no consideration, a joke, you'd win. Probably." He let that sit. "But every person in this room heard you make it. Every artist you're trying to sign tonight watched you bet $1 million against an old black man's guitar for sport, and then watched that old man turn out to be the session player you built half your catalog on and never credited. You can fight the paper, Vincent. You'll spend more than $1 million fighting what's already in this room." And that was the turn that no one, not even Marsh, had seen until it arrived, because the leverage was never really the contract. The contract was the thing that got the room to write down what it witnessed. The leverage was the witnessing. Cornelius Reed had spent 19 years on a corner learning that the music was never the only thing happening, that what mattered was who was listening and what they carried away, and he had walked into that lounge and made certain that the most powerful producer in the city committed his contempt in front of the exact audience that could cost him everything. And then he had made that same audience watch the contempt curdle into a 40-year-old crime. Vincent Marsh sat with the dead glass in his hand and understood that he had been outplayed in every way a man can be outplayed. On the instrument and in the room. By someone he had spent 4 decades not bothering to remember. What Marsh did then was the only thing left to him that was not ruin, and Cornelius had built the night so that it would be. Marsh could not undo the wager in front of the room. He could not unbe the man the artists had just watched. But he could choose what kind of story left the building, and the contract executive, sober and fast, and seeing the only road out, was already at his ear, talking low and urgent. And what she was telling him was that the smart play, the only play, was to make this a redemption instead of an exposure. Marsh paid. Not because the joke contract would have held in any court, but because $1 million was, the executive whispered, the cheapest possible price for the story. Changing from Vincent Marsh humiliated a legend to Vincent Marsh made it right. He paid it as a settlement, papered properly the next week by the same young executive, who made sure, because she had a conscience that the night had woken up, that it was structured as back royalties and acknowledgement rather than charity, that it had Cornelius Reed's name on it as what it was, payment owed for work done. But the money, which would change Simone's life, was not the thing Cornelius had actually come for, though he had not known that walking in. The thing he had come for, he understood only when he had it, was the room, was being seen, was 40 years of his hands belonging to another man's name ending in 4 minutes of those same hands, in a room full of witnesses, taking the name back. Cornelius Reed walked out of that lounge with the rain stopped and the old guitar in its case, and a folded joke contract in his coat that had done its real work the moment it made the room write down what it saw. The money came through within the month, structured the way the executive had insisted, back royalties and a credit correction that put Cornelius Reed's name, 40 years late, onto the writing credits of the songs his hands had built, so that going forward the royalties he should have earned since the start would finally root to him. It was not all of it. 40 years is not refundable, but it was enough, and more than enough, for the one thing the whole long arithmetic of his life had been pointed at. Simone went to the conservatory. Cornelius paid the tuition in full, the number he had never been able to say out loud, and he said it out loud to the bursar's office in a steady voice, and then sat in his car for a while afterward. She did not fully know, when she left, the shape of the night that had paid for it, because Cornelius told the story the way he told most things, plain and without decoration, and she was 17 and on fire to go and did not yet understand what her grandfather had carried up to that corner every morning for 19 years. She would understand it later. The understanding of what our people sacrificed for us almost always arrives later, which is its own kind of grief and its own kind of grace. The young bass player, the one who had started the applause and given the honest verdict, found Cornelius's corner a week later, because he had asked around until he found it, and he came not as a tourist, but as a student, and Cornelius, who had been teaching the whole time on that corner without anyone calling it that, taught him. Others came after. Once the story moved through the city's musicians the way stories do, and the corner at the mouth of the transit station became, quietly, a thing it had secretly always been, a school, where one of the great living players sat on a folding stool in a shiny elbowed coat and gave away, for free, to anyone humble enough to sit down and listen, the thing the industry had rented and never bought. Vincent Marsh's empire did not collapse. Men like Marsh rarely collapse all at once. But the night moved through the industry the way these things move, and the artists who had been in that room remembered what they had seen, and some of them did not sign, and the ones who did sign did so knowing exactly what their producer was, which is its own kind of diminishment. His name stayed on his buildings, but a second name now traveled alongside his in every telling of his history, the name of the session man whose hands he had built it on, and Vincent Marsh discovered that a man can spend 40 years keeping a name off the paper and lose it all in 4 minutes to the sound of the hands themselves. Cornelius did not gloat. He had a granddaughter at a conservatory, and a corner with good acoustics, and a guitar that was finally, in the public record, his own work under his own name. And he found that the bitterness he had refused to carry for 40 years had nowhere to live now anyway, because the thing it would have fed on was settled. On a clear morning that fall, Cornelius Reed set up at the mouth of the transit station, at the same time he always did, laid the blue cloth in the open case, tuned the old amber-topped guitar by ear because his ear was still better than any machine they made, and played for the people hurrying past to their trains, most of whom did not stop, most of whom did not know that the sound of their morning was one of the great players in the country giving it away for nothing, the same as he had every day for 19 years, the same as he would for as long as his hands still answered. His phone buzzed once in his coat pocket, a message from 3 states away, a short video Simone had sent of herself in a practice room, playing something he had taught her, playing it clean and playing it true, his hands living on in hers. He let the song he was playing finish before he looked at it. He always let the song finish. Then he watched his granddaughter play, in a room he had paid for with 4 minutes and 40 years, and he started the next song. The best guitar in the city sat in a battered case on a folding stool, and every morning, for free, it told the truth. Have you ever had your best work signed by someone else's name? And did you ever get the chance to take it back? And the harder question, when you have been the one with the power to credit someone or to keep them invisible, which did you choose? And would they tell the story the way you do? Tell me in the comments about a time your work was taken, or a time you made sure someone got the credit they earned. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us. Like it so it reaches someone who needs it, and share it with one person who knows that genius doesn't always come in a new case.